to the first video in my design series. This video is about rules. I love rules. I'm excited about them, as you can tell by the smile and the gestures and everything. Like, this is what I actually want to talk about. I almost filled the Kickstarter pitch video with all the stuff about the rules of Feed, but, you know, after some feedback, people telling me that people are actually more interested in like playing a vampire as opposed to all the clever things I've done with the dice in this game. Now is my chance. You are here, presumably because you're interested in the rules. So let me talk about how this game works. From the ground up, I created Feed to mechanically support the tropes of vampire literature while keeping it open for the flexibility of setting and style. That was the biggest single hurdle that I had in making Feed what I wanted it to be. So this starts at the very lowest level, which is traits. The simplest kind of trait is like the human trait that you come up with during character creation. There's 16 questions that you answer. Each one, the answer becomes a trait, and it fills the 16 boxes on the character sheet. So these are things that describe your character in all these different physical, emotional ways, describes their relationships to the world around them, and creates really rounded characters. One of the things I'm happiest about in the system is the character creation. Once you define a trait by answering one of these questions, you then rate it on a 2-axis scale. You get a die pool, and the dice pool is going to have a die number and a die size. So you'll have like, you know, a 1d4 or a 2d12. The die size, it's sort of like the traditional strength of the stat that you would see in other role-playing games. So a d12 is a stronger ability, one that's more helpful to you than a d10, which is in turn stronger than a d6. All the way down to the d3, which is so low that when you roll a d3 trait, it actually is more likely to fail and hurt you than to help you. The die number, the number of dice in your dice pool, is not about how strong the trait is, but it's about how important it is to your character and the story. So when you're creating your character, you're not only deciding for each trait, you know, how helpful is this, but you're also deciding how important is this. The number of dice you have is at least as important. I would say it's equally important to the die size. But it doesn't really grow with age and experience. It's about priorities. And it doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, how powerful, how weak. The question of what's of great narrative importance to your character and what's of lesser importance, which is sort of like half a metagame question, that's going to be the same. When you roll a trait, you simply roll its die pool. The simplest way to do this is a solo roll. All you do is roll the trait by itself. The dice that fail, that come up a 2 or under, you push away from your pool and you keep the ones that succeed. If the dice that succeeded outnumber the dice that failed, then you succeed at the solo roll. If the opposing dice, the dice that failed and that you pushed away, are outnumbering the ones you got to keep, then you fail. Simple as that. The much more common kind of roll is a simple roll where 2 characters roll their traits against each other. And it works very much the same way. Let's say Ravi here rolls his trait, and then the opponent or an obstacle has a trait. The GM will roll against him. They both roll their dice, and then each one passes any failures, any 1s or 2s that came up, to the other person's dice pool. It's called scooping dice. You scoop your opponent's dice that came up 2 or lower. And then whoever has the most dice wins. On these simple rolls, when you roll a die that's a 2 or under, then you normally pass it to your opponent, right? They would scoop your die, and that would contribute to their success. However, you have a choice. You can take trait damage to resist passing these failure dice to your opponent. You can keep them instead, and they count for you. When you take trait damage, you can see it. It's in these 4 little boxes next to the general trait category. It's pretty small in the shot you're seeing now. So each of these boxes represents a die of trait damage. That's a D3 added to all your rolls in that category. Instead of actually failing the task, you could describe your character getting through adversity, right? Bad things are happening, you're having bad luck, but you're pushing through. You get hurt, but you get what you were after. You win your roll. So, for example, someone who's willing to take punches is going to be a lot better at getting their licks in a fight, but they're also going to take a lot of damage. The higher your die number is, the more control you therefore have over whether you succeed or fail on a roll. If you have really bad rolls, you know, if you've got a 3d12 trait but you roll all 1s, that high die number means that you can take a trait damage and keep all 3 of those dice. The high die number of 3 gives you lots of control over whether you're going to actually succeed or fail at a given task, as long as you're willing to pay for it with trait damage. This came out of playtesting, and I think it's really important to the system, that whatever your character focuses on in terms of die number, the parts of the character that are important rather than just incidental, those are the parts of the game where you're going to have great involvement. There's going to be high stakes. When your character does get badly hurt, it's usually going to be in scenes that are involving those things they really care about. However, those scenes are also going to be the ones where you can really control your character's fate more than you can normally. And because the die number is different from die size, it means that, the Xander at your table can have just as much influence in some ways as, the Willow or the Buffy, because they're going to have higher die sizes, but everybody has the same die number values to split around. At the next level of complexity up from simple rolls are conflicts, which are just a string of simple rolls. Every time you succeed at one against somebody, you inflict a strike on them. After 3 strikes, you win the conflict. You do what you were trying to do, and they can't stop you. The strikes are separate from trait damage, which is another important aspect of feed. Normally, you take a traditional RPG, you got your hit points, you lose hit points when you fail a roll, and when you're out of hit points, then you're done. In feed, you accumulate trait damage mainly by pushing hard to succeed on rolls. So you could be inflicting strikes, getting closer and closer to winning a conflict, yet be taking a lot more damage than your opponent who is quote-unquote losing. Conflicts are partly about who has better stats and who wins or loses. But they're partly about who's willing to sacrifice more, or at least risk more, for success. Now you bring all these things together and you can see how they support the vampire genre when you look at hunger. You've got a hunger track split into multiple traits. Each one of these little bundles of hunger dots is a trait of its own. These traits end up getting rolled against you by your own addiction, which is played by the other characters at the table. So when you encounter a situation that's tempting to you based on your addiction, based on the fact you're a vampire, somebody at the table is going to notice that and say, hey, that hunger trait you've got filled in right now because you're hungry. I'm going to roll it against you and try to force you to give in to your addiction. You then have to roll one of your human traits against it and try to resist. There's also something that's longer term. There's something called the group tracking sheet. And this is something that I don't know why other games don't have it, why all other games don't have it, but as soon as I created it for feed, I wanted it for all of them. The group tracking sheet tracks everything about the PCs in the game. It gives you as a GM access to their traits and those values and all that stuff. But it also has these little spaces that you fill in when those traits are stressed. So every time you give into addiction, every time you feed during a session, you have to stress one of your human traits. After a certain amount of stress, a trait comes into question. It comes to a moment of crisis. And at that time, the GM plans for the next session for there to be a temptation conflict. It's a series of simple rolls in which all of your hunger kind of comes after you, and you have to resist it with everything you have, all the human traits you can bring to bear, and avoid losing something important to you, one of your human traits. So for example, if you've got a human trait about your relationship with, your parents, and you've been stressing that trait because you've been out feeding when they expected you to be around, they don't know what you're up to, they see that your health is failing, all that stuff. Every session one of those things happens, the GM is marking that down on the group tracking sheet that you're stressing that trait. And then once it's reached a certain point, even if this sort of subplot started 5 or 6 sessions back and other things have been happening, the GM's going to have that mechanical reminder like, oh yeah, he's really been pushing it with his parents and it's about time to get back to that subplot and blow it off. The GM plans a moment of crisis where you basically have to choose between the relationship with your parents and feeding the addiction. And everyone at the table cooperatively plays your hunger in a conflict against your human self. And if you fail that conflict, you give in to the addiction whether you want to or not. So it really does become a complex character situation of what you're willing to sacrifice, what you can achieve, prioritizing what's important to your character, and trying to keep the addiction under control when it's something that ultimately, even though they're traits on your sheet, they're played by the other people at the table and they're managed by the GM. So in that way, it really models addiction well. It's something that you can manage, but you can't actually control. So when you bring all these things together, what you find is a game that's focused on what characters care about, asking dramatic questions about what they're willing to do and what they're able to do. It focuses tightly on character subplots, and it structures the game around hunger and recovery and degeneration. So all these things work together to create character drama and to make hunger a constant, palpable force in the game. The game is called Feed for a reason. Fundamentally, vampires are defined by this craving for blood, and the system is hardwired to constantly bring that back up to the fore of the game without being distracting, without excluding other things, but always it's going to come back. Like, if you're playing an addict, you don't get to just forget about feeding because it's convenient. You're always going to have to return to the effect it's having on you until you ultimately conquer it for good, if you can. Obviously, there are more rules in a 140-page game book that I can cover in a short video, but just hopefully that shows you that the core of the system, the traits, the conflicts, the way hunger works, all those things are going to support and help a vampire story in a way that just any generic system won't.